They thought they'd found an easy mark, a quiet, solitary man in an old roadside diner. But when a gang of troublemakers pushed too far, they learned the hard way. The calmest people often conceal the most formidable strength. Never underestimate someone based on what you think you see. Before we dive in, tell us, from where are you watching this video? Share in the comments below. This is the story of Ethan Hayes, a former Marine whose peaceful lunch took a dramatic turn when a gang of bikers decided to make him their target. But within minutes, their arrogance turned to regret. The wind howled as Ethan pulled into Carla's Diner, an unassuming spot on the outskirts of a small desert town. Its faded neon sign flickered against the twilight sky, while a weathered gas pump leaned at an awkward angle outside. Inside, the place smelled of overcooked grease and stale coffee, its checkered tiles and torn red booths, relics of a bygone era. Ethan pushed open the door, the jingling bell announcing his arrival. A handful of patrons glanced his way, but most returned to their meals. All except a group of bikers near the back. Their leather jackets bore the emblem of a local motorcycle club, and their raucous laughter ceased as their sharp gazes followed Ethan to a corner booth. He sat facing the door, an instinct honed through years of training. The waitress, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a nervous smile, approached hesitantly. "What can I get you?" she asked, her gaze flickering toward the bikers. "Cheeseburger, fries, and black coffee," Ethan replied in a low, steady voice. He handed her the menu and settled in, calmly tracing the rim of his coffee cup once she set it down. The low murmur of conversation resumed, but the bikers' focus remained fixed on Ethan. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and an arrogant sneer, leaned back in his chair. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we've got ourselves a stranger." His companions chuckled, their laughter carrying an edge of malice. Ethan remained silent, sipping his coffee as if their taunts were no more than background noise. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the bearded man barked, slamming his palm on the table. The sound cut through the diner like a gunshot. Ethan set his cup down deliberately and looked up, his expression calm and unbothered. "Something I can help you with?" The man's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "You're sitting where you don't belong. Around here, people like you learn to respect the locals." Behind him, one of his buddies snickered. "Show him, Troy. Teach him some manners." Ethan exhaled softly, his eyes locking with Troy's. "I'm just here for a meal," he said evenly. "Not looking for trouble." Troy's fist came down hard on the table, rattling the silverware. "Maybe you didn't hear me," he snarled. The tension in the room was palpable. The other diners froze, their forks suspended mid-air, while the waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. Ethan's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I heard you, and I suggest you back off." Troy's bravado faltered again, but he covered it with a smirk. "Or what?" he challenged. The diner went silent, save for the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner. Everyone's attention was on Ethan, who sat unmoving, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Last chance," Troy said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You can walk out now, or we'll make sure you regret staying." Ethan leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed. "I'd rather finish my lunch," he replied. Troy's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Fine," he said, signaling to his crew. "We'll make this quick." Chairs scraped against the floor as 4 other bikers rose, forming a loose semicircle around Ethan's booth. Their confidence was evident in their swagger, their smirks, and their cracking knuckles. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't flinch. His stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Troy lunged first, his hand reaching for Ethan's collar, but in the blink of an eye, Ethan was out of his seat, his movements fluid and precise. Troy's wrist, twisting it effortlessly and slamming him against the table. The impact reverberated through the diner, and Troy let out a grunt of pain as he crumpled to the floor. The room was stunned into silence. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, hesitated before charging forward. His fist swung wildly, but Ethan sidestepped with ease, driving a calculated elbow into the man's stomach. The biker doubled over, wheezing, before Ethan guided him into a nearby chair where he collapsed. Two down. The remaining bikers exchanged uneasy glances before deciding to attack together. One reached for a chair, swinging it overhead, while another aimed for Ethan's legs. But Ethan was ready. He ducked under the chair, using its momentum to shove the attacker into a booth. Then, with a swift kick, he sent the other biker sprawling to the floor. Four down. The last man, a lanky figure with nervous eyes, froze. He looked at Ethan, then at his fallen friends, and made a decision. Without a word, he bolted for the door, the bell jingling wildly as he disappeared into the night. Ethan straightened his shirt, his breathing steady. The bikers groaned on the floor, too stunned and battered to move. Troy, still slumped against the table, glared at Ethan with a mix of pain and disbelief. Who are you?" he managed to mutter. Ethan's expression remained calm, unreadable. "Just a guy trying to have lunch," he said quietly. The tension in the diner eased slightly as the other patrons began to stir. The waitress finally moved from behind the counter, her face pale but her voice steady. "Are you okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded, returning to his booth as if nothing had happened. He picked up his burger, taking a bite while the room buzzed with hushed whispers. Out from the kitchen, his spatula clutched tightly in one hand. What just happened?" he asked no one in particular. Chris didn't answer, she just stared at Ethan, a mixture of awe and gratitude in her eyes. Struggling to sit up. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice weak but defiant. At him, his gaze as steady as ever. "Neither do you." To push himself to his feet, but his legs buckled under him and he slumped back to the floor with a pained grunt. His crew wasn't in any better shape. Most of them were still groaning where they'd fallen, clutching bruises and cradling their injured egos. The aura of dominance they carried when they walked into the diner had been shattered, replaced by humiliation, toward their pitiful attempts to regain composure. He calmly finished his burger, occasionally glancing at the other patrons, who were still stealing wide-eyed looks in his direction. The waitress approached hesitantly, holding a coffee pot as if it were some kind of shield. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nodded. "Sure, thanks," and shook as she poured the steaming liquid into his cup, but she couldn't help herself from blurting out, "Who are you? I mean, what you just did, that was..." Ethan took a sip of the coffee, savoring its bitterness. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies," he said with a faint smile. "That's all." Her mouth opened to say more, but before she could, the faint wail of sirens pierced the air. Someone had called the police. The bell above the diner door jingled again as two officers stepped inside, their hands resting cautiously on their holsters. "What's going on here?" barked the lead officer, a stocky man with a thick mustache and an authoritative tone. His eyes darted from the battered biker sprawled across the floor to Ethan, who sat calmly at his booth as if the chaos around him were an everyday occurrence. The waitress spoke up first, her voice shaky but firm. "It was self-defense. Those guys," she pointed to the bikers, "they started it. This man didn't do anything wrong." The officer frowned, his gaze narrowing on Ethan. "That true?" he asked. Ethan nodded, his demeanor composed. "They were looking for trouble. I just made sure they didn't find much of it." Troy, still clutching his ribs, sneered from the floor. "He attacked us. We weren't doing anything, and he just jumped us out of nowhere." The officer glanced down at Troy, then back at Ethan. The stark contrast between the calm, unassuming man sitting at the booth and the group of bruised and beaten bikers told a story all its own. "Is that right?" the officer said skeptically. He gestured to the other diners. "Anybody else see it differently?" The patrons began speaking up in unison, their voices overlapping as they recounted the scene. "They started it. He was just sitting there minding his own business. Those guys were harassing him." The officer held up his hand to silence the room. All right. Looks like we've got ourselves a clear picture." He turned to Troy and his crew. "You boys have been causing trouble around here for weeks. Maybe it's time you learned your lesson." Troy glared at Ethan, his jaw tight. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled. "We've got connections." The officer let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But unless one of those connections is a lawyer, I'd suggest you stay quiet." He signaled to his partner. "Cuff him." The younger officer, a wiry man with a buzz cut, moved quickly to restrain the bikers. Troy resisted, but a sharp twist of his arm quickly ended his protest. The others followed without much of a fight, their earlier bravado completely drained. As the officers escorted the gang out of the diner, the lead officer paused by Ethan's table. "Thanks for keeping things from getting worse," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "But next time maybe call us before things get out of hand." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Noted, tipped his hat slightly before following his partner out the door. The sound of the sirens faded into the distance, leaving the diner in an uneasy silence. The other patrons began murmuring among themselves, their voices a mix of admiration and disbelief. She approached Ethan again, this time with a slice of pie in her hand. "On the house," she said with a small smile, setting the plate in front of him. An eyebrow. "I didn't order this. Consider it a thank you," she said. "Not just from me, but from everyone here. Those guys have been terrorizing this town for months. Nobody's ever stood up to them like that." Ethan hesitated for a moment before picking up his fork. "Well," he said, taking a bite of the pie, "I'm glad I could help." As he finished his meal, the atmosphere in the diner began to lighten. The other patrons returned to their conversations, their voices no longer tinged with fear. The waitress refilled coffee cups with a renewed sense of energy, and even the cook emerged from the kitchen to thank Ethan personally. When he finally stood to leave, the entire diner seemed to pause. The waitress followed him to the door, her smile warm but curious. "Will we see you again?" she asked. Ethan pulled a few bills from his pocket and placed them on the counter. "Maybe," he said, his tone enigmatic. "Take care." With that, he stepped outside, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over the empty parking lot. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off into the horizon, leaving behind a diner full of people who would never forget the day they met the quiet stranger who wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right.